Hello, this is Michael Sulak, and this video is going to be a quick introduction to R Markdown. So in order to create an R Markdown file, the first thing you want to do is start RStudio, and then I'm going to go to File and create a new file, and the option I want is R Markdown. And when I do that, I get a box that gives me a few options. And then you have three different types of files you can create. A markdown file is a method within RStudio to end up with a finished product of one of these three types. For this demonstration, I'm just going to leave the final output being an HTML file and click OK. And then my markdown file here is created and able to be edited in this top left window. So what Markdown is a combination of being able to write text combined with R code. And so when you look at this example file that was created, the top part here is a header section. The next thing we see is this shaded area, and this is what's referred to as a code chunk. These shaded areas contain R code that will be run when the final output file is created. So in your example file that R gives you, you can see they've already included a few of these different areas, and between them there's some written text. Let me show you what happens when you create the final output file. And you do that through something known as knitting the file. There's a button right here to do that. So when I knit this file, well, first of all, it wants me to give it a file name. Then I can save that. And now what I've created is an HTML file that consists of R code output in between regular text. If you look here, this very first code chunk is setting some options I'll talk about a little later. And there's no output from this code chunk that appears in the final document. After the title and author and date are displayed here, the next thing that our HTML file includes is this section of text. And in R Markdown, you have the ability to do some text formatting of a variety of different types. Here they have 2 pound signs before this R Markdown, and that's why in the output file the words R Markdown appear bigger and bold. And then we have the text. Now we have another code chunk. The breakdown of this code chunk is that they'll start with 3 of these symbols here, which are left tick marks. On my keyboard, they're located to the left of the 1. They're not single quotation marks. And then we have this section here, which is saying that the code that's going to follow is R code. And there's a little title for this section called cars. And the only R code that is in this section is giving a summary of this built-in data set to R called cars. So if we look at our HTML file, we see that bit of code that was included in that section repeated here. And then we see the output from the summary in this box here. So then we have another section of text with another heading created by the 2 pound signs, and then another code chunk, which in this instance is called pressure. And there's an option here in this code chunk that's going to affect the output for only this particular chunk, which is echo equals false. So echo is a particular setting, and what that setting does, and they actually tell you down here, is that when you set echo to false, you don't end up seeing this plot pressure in your output. The only output created by this particular code chunk is this plot here, which is using another built-in data set, this time called pressure. So that is what an R Markdown file is. It's a way for you to create documents that use a mixture of written text, or there could be links, or you could have pictures. And within that text, you can include R code. When you have a document created by code within the document here, if the data ever changed, then the plots will automatically change as well. So it can be a really nice way to create reports or presentations or things like that. So the next thing I'm going to talk about are setting the options for what your R code ends up putting in your final document here. So first of all, if we look at the very first code chunk, I see that they're calling this one setup, and there's an option that's only for this particular code chunk, which is include equals false. What that's doing is making it so that any output from this code chunk isn't being shown in the final document. If I deleted this and then created the HTML file again, then we get a box here showing the contents of the R code that was included in that code chunk. But let's put that back because we don't actually need to see this code. Let's talk about what this code is doing. The important part here is that within the parentheses in this part of the code, you can put different settings that will end up affecting all the rest of the code chunks. For example, they have echo equals true set here. And we talked about that earlier. That echo option determines whether or not you see the R code from each code chunk. So if I delete that and run this again, then we see that there's these two chunks and each of their R code is appearing in our final document. But if I change this to false and knit it again, then that R code isn't shown anymore because now this setting is applying to both of these chunks down here. So that's one way you can affect the output of your file. If you decided, for example, that you wanted to see this particular piece of code but not this one, you also have the ability to set options within each particular code chunk. So I could add echo equals true to this code chunk. And so what's going to happen is that I'm going to see this particular piece of code and then not see this one. And so we can see that result over here on the right in our HTML file. So I'm going to change this echo to true, which is going to apply to every code chunk in my file, which means that I don't need this one down here. It's redundant. And I'm going to add a couple more options in this position right here, which are going to affect the rest of my document. Another option that I'm going to change is warning equals false, which is just going to suppress the printing of any warnings that might get created when my R code is run. And I know that might just sound a little confusing, but you might encounter it later when you create some code, you run it, and then you see this weird stuff along with the code and you're like, what is that? Warning equals false will prevent some of those from happening. And another thing that you might not want appearing are something called messages, which are again just some text details that R might create along with your output. So I'm going to set that one to false as well. And so these are the settings for a lot of your documents that I recommend. Having echo is true so that your code is seen, and then having warning and message both equaling false. So another useful option you can change is that if you notice when this plot for this dataset pressure was created, it ended up being this size, and you might want to change that. You might think it's too big or too small. And so how you can do that, say I wanted to just do it for this particular code chunk, is using an option called out.width. And that's going to equal a value. And the way the syntax works for that is now within quotes. And so how you set the out.width is you just put a number and a percentage, and there's other ways to do it as well. But what we're going to say is I'd like this to be smaller than it is by default. So now if I knit this document again, you'll see that that makes that plot smaller. If you want to change the text, you can obviously just, as you might expect, and without any pound signs before it. When I knit this, you'll see that this text is just going to be sort of normal sized here. So if you're curious about what are the different ways to format text in a Markdown document, you can just Google it. And this cheat sheet isn't a bad place to look. If you see here, then normal text is just exported normally. You can make things italics by including asterisks around them. What I was talking about earlier, you can make text bigger and bolder by including a different number of pound signs before the text. You can make lists and tables and things like that. So there's just a couple more features I'll show you. One is if you want to make a code chunk, there is a button up here for insert a new code chunk. And what we want is it to be R code. And so it gives me the format for having a code chunk, which starts with 3 of these tick marks and ends with 3 of these tick marks. And you could also, if you wanted to, create one manually. The R is letting the computer know that this is specifically going to include R code, and then ending it with 3 tick marks too. The button's just a little faster. So maybe I want to display, say, the first few rows of cars. There's a function called head for doing that, for showing just the beginning. So when I run that, here's my display of my code and there's the output. If I wanted to name this something, and say I named it cars again, and I tried to knit this, it says error duplicate chunk label cars, execution halted. Ooh, it does not like 2 things having the same name. So that's the basics of an R Markdown document. You include text in these light areas. You can format that text with a variety of options. You include R code in these code chunks that appear dark gray, which if you want to, you can actually run the code without creating the whole document. I could click this run line. But this is just a temporary, here's what this looks like. It's not actually affecting your output. If I knit the file, nothing changes. And you'll notice that an R Markdown file has an extension .rmd. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know. This is Michael Sulak, and I will see you next time.